As you've heard, I've been asked to talk about higher education from the viewpoint of someone who lives in the north. That's a relatively new experience for me because I have, as you again have heard, spent the vast majority of my life in the south, South Africa to be specific. So it's been a curious and instructive experience, both moving from a part of the hemisphere which we categorize as developing to a society we categorize as developed. In itself a rather curious and even annoying terminology, implying a kind of cessation of progress and evolution. And it's been curious and instructive just thinking about our purposes today. So at one level, wherever we are, much of our lives are dominated by the same forces. Massive forces, of course, like the international financial crises, climate change, pandemics like influenza and AIDS, yawning gulfs between the rich and poor, war, tides of refugees, many more besides. The point is that all these things cross a spectrum. They cross a spectrum of politics, they cross a spectrum of economics, technology, ecological affairs. And as Homer Dixon reminds us in his marvelous little book called The Ingenuity Gap, these things converge, intertwine, and often seem to be largely beyond our ken, incomprehensible even to our leaders and specialists. And of course, the meltdown in the world's economy plays out differently in different parts of the world, and even, of course, in different households. The great catch-all that we call globalization of itself has already caused massive changes. Dramatic changes in demographics, of course, are different in different parts of the world, but all are significant. Whole new economies emerging, not the least of which is that rendered possible by the internet. And cultural boundaries are being redrawn, as Manuel Castells and others have so persuasively argued. And of course, the rapid escalation in market-driven and technology-enabled innovations has changed the sense of the possible in parts of the world we would never have guessed at. Now, the sheer scale of change, and perhaps more importantly, the nature of change, with its insistence often on higher-level skills and the coinage of so-called knowledge societies, have contributed to an exponential increase in the demand for tertiary education. And that exponential increase is worldwide. A dramatic change also in the role and the function of the university. The fact is that north or south, east or west, higher education is challenged. Some countries have more money to spend on education. Some countries have different priorities. Some countries have inadequate infrastructure. But all are required to change on a scale which is unprecedented. Now, in general terms, leaving aside the financial crisis, we already knew that we were not doing well enough as a global society in addressing the numbers needing education. We haven't enough schools, we haven't enough universities, we haven't enough teachers, we haven't enough academics. And with the demographics being what they are, it is clear that financially speaking, building the vast infrastructure required by traditional bricks and mortars universities, colleges and schools to meet such a demand is simply not a viable proposition, even if we could staff such an infrastructure. Even in reasonably rich countries, governments, policymakers, donor bodies, even members of the public have come to recognize that there are other models, for higher education at least, which can and do run in parallel with the traditional, conventional public sector higher education system. So what we are seeing is a blurring of public-private boundaries, a blurring of distance and residential, a blurring of full-time and part-time study, and all these are manifestations of an underlying metamorphosis in higher education to meet not only the needs of the 21st century, but the rights of people to be educated, both in developed and developing countries, and also, of course, the possibilities enabled by technology. I think that the blurring of the public-private boundary has been perhaps one of the most dramatic changes we have seen in the last decade in higher education. According to a recent UK universities report on private universities, over 1 in 3 students globally is now studying in the private sector. The fact is that it's the scale of the demand for education that has attracted the private sector to the market, and in the process, of course, promoted more competition, intense competition, competition between nations, competition between economies, and of course, competition between universities. And such competition is less and less respectful of national boundaries, north or south. So contrary to opinion in some quarters, it seems to me this is no bad thing. It brings more hands to the wheel, and indeed, we've seen some countries actually have strategies which promote private sector in order to meet the need. For example, countries like Malaysia and Vietnam. The private sector is even challenging the game in that most fundamental terrain of the university, research. Take InnoCentive, an initiative founded by the pharmaceutical Eli Lilly in 2001, the first global web community for open innovation. It enables scientists, engineers, professionals, and entrepreneurs to collaborate in the research and development-driven organizations and deliver breakthrough solutions. InnoCentive seekers, who collectively spent billions of dollars on research and development, simply submit complex problems to the InnoCentive marketplace, where more than 170,000 engineers, scientists, inventors, business people, and research organizations in more than 175 countries are simply invited to solve them. That represents a fundamental transformation in the research and development model. And the rewards can be very high. The people who deliver the most innovative solutions receive financial rewards of up to $1 million. And there's another, in my opinion, rather dramatic demonstration of competitive forces, and that has been what is called the unbundling or disaggregation of educational activities and processes, turning them into lots of different businesses. And that, in turn, changing the landscape that few of us could have imagined. Think about the value chain going up to make the business of a university, starting from marketing at the one end, content production, delivery, tutoring, student support, right up to assessment. What we see now are new providers that target specific activities, one or other of those activities and processes. And as you can imagine, that changes the costings and the pricing assumptions that we make, and indeed changes the whole business model. I'll give you just one example to illustrate the point. Publishers and media companies have turned the textbook market into entirely new businesses. Think about Pearson's, Sage, Elsevier. These are organizations that are into content production. Always were, you might say. But they have partnerships with universities, some of which accredit their offerings, and their offerings, I will remind you, are mostly conceptualized, designed, and written by top academics working part-time for handsome remuneration and unconstrained by faculty and university processes. Publishing as an industry, we find, has been deeply affected by technology and the internet, and is having to reconceptualize what its business is. Pearson's, for example, no longer describe themselves as a publishing business. They describe themselves as an education business. Right, so now I'd like to move on to the massive and indeed disruptive technological changes which are impacting on higher education worldwide, but of course more so in countries where the cyber infrastructure is sophisticated. I want to say at the outset, as I have said in other quarters, that I absolutely do not agree that technology is just a tool. We now have at our disposal, again, some of us more than others, far more than a tool. And let me give you 6 reasons for saying that, although I'm sure there must be many more. First of all, it enables us to communicate with more people than at any previous time in history, which brings with it marvelous possibilities. Secondly, it's enabled the convergence of different modalities. We now have anytime, anywhere, anyhow. The rise of the telephone, so to speak. The iPhone, the Kindle, and other devices are making it possible to carry around vast amounts of information and are affordable a way of staying networked. Thirdly, it facilitates personalization, one of the major trends of our time. Fourthly, it's promoted openness in previously unimagined ways, open source, open content, open educational resources. And this in turn has promoted sharing our knowledge, sharing our experiences, sharing our common wealth, if you like.